here, Mr. Nigel. Yes, Mr. Nigel, since arriving in Bali, Mr. Nigel has established numerous business enterprise. And your first being Yanis Restaurant in Legian Kota, right, sir? So it's on like 1989.
No, that was 1985.
1985, okay. You may use the microphone, sir.
Yes, Yanis was established in 1985, just after my wife and I got married.
So you have been living here in Bali for over than 30 years?
42 years.
42 years, wow. What a great experiences, of course. In 42 years, you have
a lot of changes.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much.
Going back to the start, I came to Bali in 1980, and when I arrived, it was a very different island to what it is today. And we've seen so many changes that it's almost hard to keep up with them, especially in the last 20 years. Things were very much the same for probably 10 years or so after I arrived. It wasn't really till the 90s we started to see the big changes. And of course we've been through some bad times. We had SARS, then we had Bali Bomb 1 and 2, as has been mentioned. And of course the worst of all is the current situation we've just got out of. Now, talking about Bali, we're talking about these very important things: rethinking, redefining and reshaping. When we're doing this, the first thing we have to do, of course, is to look at ourselves very critically in Bali and see what we have done wrong and what we got right. And in the things we are getting right, we should concentrate on those things and try to put behind us the mistakes that have been made in the past. Looking at the island today, there seems to be this rush to develop along the coast, where I escaped. My first business was down in Legian, and I was very happy to eventually move up into the Ubud area with my business and get to where the air was cleaner and the grass was greener, so to speak. I started the first rafting company in 1989, 1990, went on to open the Elephant Park in 1997, which is the first time that a business that it was about animals in such a way was done. Unlike a zoo, we do it very differently, and consequently it's been very challenging and very exciting. In recent years, just before COVID, we started our first business outside tourism, which was Mason chocolate, and that was doing quite well until COVID hit, and then we got knocked like everybody else. I'm sure all of you here have been through some very, very bad times. We are one of those. We lost all our finances in that time, and we have had to start again. Now, starting again gives us an opportunity to think what it was that we didn't quite see in the past, where we should go. Looking down on the coast to particularly Canggu, we see that this area has developed into a hodgepodge of clubs and restaurants and everything, and is not what I see Bali as being. Okay, it's important for tourists to have places to be entertained and fed. We know that, but it shouldn't be the main concentration of the island. This island is a Hindu island. It has beautiful culture. It has exquisite tourism objects to go and see. And I think that's where we need to get back our roots to try and, rethink what Bali was and how it should be into the future. Obviously, we're looking at the arrival, first of all. When people come to Bali, the first thing they see is the airport. This was mentioned before also. I've had a number of tourists who've come in recently who have complained bitterly about the airport's arrival. Not about the building. The building is fabulous. It's all been built beautifully. Everything looks wonderful. But the attitude of the people greeting them is far from friendly. In complete opposite to that, if we go to Thailand, we're welcomed with open arms. Everybody is very happy to see tourists. They make it as easy as possible to get into Thailand without having to worry about too much red tape or scowling faces looking at them. So I think one of the things we really need to think hard about is how we change the entrance to Bali so people can see that this is a friendly Hindu island, not an island where it's treated like a police state. Yes, there are rules after COVID, but I think we've seen the rest of the world recently, particularly the coronation in England, where we saw no masks in the whole country, not one. I watched the whole coronation on television because England is where I was originally born, so I was very interested. And I was at the coronation of the Queen in 1953. That's how old I am. I think only 7% of the planet were alive at that time. But when we talk about what's happening to Bali now, we have to really think very hard, what do we want to do? It was mentioned by the Vice Governor about rafting, for instance, which of course is one of my businesses, and he said it was $65 back in the 80s, and now it's being bought for $10. Now, why is this happening? We have to look at the reasons for this. What's happening? What the word is, the one word that describes it, is desperation. People are desperate to try and get money back in their pockets. We have to understand this. You know, I had 700 staff when COVID called, and many of those staff, reluctantly, we had to let go over the first 6 months of COVID. Now they're all starting to come back as Bali was recovering. But Bali hasn't recovered and will not recover for quite some time yet completely. And my estimation is probably only about 35 to 40% of tourists, international tourists, that have come back to the island. Yes, there are many local tourists to take their place from Java, but unfortunately they don't spend the same money and they don't want to do the same things that international tourists want to do. So we have to consider that when we're looking at how to make Bali recover financially. With the rafting industry, as I mentioned, as the governor, Vice Governor mentioned, that they're selling it for as little as $10 now. Now, why are they doing it? What's the reason for that? Well, the reason is that there are so many unlicensed companies. These are not really companies, they're operations. And these operations do not follow the rules. Many of them don't own any equipment. They don't own the rafts, they don't own the life jackets or the paddles or the helmets, and they certainly don't have any infrastructure. Most of their staff are hired daily according to their needs, so they're not even sustaining staff in that way. These are all daily recruited operators. Many of those daily recruited people do not have any qualifications. Many of them don't even swim, and they're on the river in a raft. So we have to wonder why this is happening, and the reason is that the government, I'm afraid, has neglected this industry and let it deteriorate into what it is today. What happens is that the quality goes down, the standards drop dramatically, and safety starts to be a big problem, as we've seen lately with some deaths on the river due to bad infrastructure, and one young guide nearly drowned the other day on the river due to them not having the just basic safety equipment, which all rafting companies should have. So there needs to be something looked into that. I also see people taking up tourists, international tourists that is, taking up the road in trucks that are normally used for moving cows and pigs. Well, this is ridiculous. They put a couple of benches in and suddenly it becomes a tourist transport operation. Now that is illegal, even under Indonesian law, and should be honestly looked into and stopped, because it doesn't make a good example of tourism in Bali. It only makes us look very cheap and nasty. So the prices are low because of this lack of infrastructure. There is no overheads for these people, unlike a company like ours, which has massive overheads because we give a service that's not given by others. Other companies that are coming up in the adventure industry are ATVs. I see ATV companies everywhere. These ATV companies are using the government roads. They're travelling up and down them with tourists in the back, and these tourists are putting their lives in danger. They shouldn't be on the road, they're not licensed, and the vehicles, the ATVs they travel on, are also not licensed. So I asked one good friend of mine who is a policeman why this is happening. And he said, well, the police are not really that interested. They're not interested in policing those things now. You'll notice in the last few years we haven't seen any police roadblocks on the road. That's fantastic. I hated the police roadblocks, having to stop and show my licence and all that, as I'm sure all of you do too. However, it served a purpose. It stopped illegal buses, it stopped illegal drivers, and it certainly caught people who weren't licensed. The same policeman told me that 30% of all vehicles on the road in Bali are not licensed. In other words, they're not legal. So this has all deteriorated over COVID to the point where now a big job needs to be done to get this back together, because this is going to help to deteriorate the quality of tourism in Bali. Do we want to sell $10 rafting? Do we want to sell $50 rooms? I mean, these are the things that all of you would say no, because it's nice to have it, but it isn't good for tourism, and tourism will not recover. At the moment, we're seeing the bottom end of the market in Bali, not the top end. We haven't seen the big money people coming back yet, because it's too early. It will happen, but slowly. But to get them back, we need to give them a high-quality destination, a destination that has all the safety, all the infrastructure, and all the service that they expect. Because we're up against a lot of destinations of the world now, many, many, many. As I mentioned, Thailand, it's only one of many places that have now got their game together. They're really pushing hard, they're advertising on television every day. Bali's got to do some work. We've got to get that back. We've got to get Bali itself has got to start advertising itself, not just Indonesia, but Bali itself. We need to start looking at what do we need to do to get those people to come to Bali, because they've got plenty of choices. They've got all of Europe, Spain, all those places in fantastic destinations. And they've got a lot of Asian countries now. Vietnam has come from nowhere. Now it's a wonderful destination, I'm told. Not having been there myself, I can only go by what I hear. But it's now supposedly a very wonderful destination. And of course, Thailand, we all know. Malaysia, Singapore, of course, is always top of the world's market. So we've got to really think about how we get people back to Bali. They're not just going to come, magically. We have to actually do something to get them back. We have to improve Bali to get them back. We've been through some very bad times, and like all of you, my infrastructure suffered very badly through them. In fact, most of the money that we're now making is being spent on repairing the infrastructure, which has been damaged by 2.5 years of closure. So I sympathise with all of you in the tourism business, because we're in the same boat, same problems, same worries, and same financial issues. What we've got to do is work together, guys. Everybody, one and all of us, we have to work together and make sure that we work as a team, because only teams can work. This is what I do with my staff. I tell them, work as a team. You're not individuals when you come to work. You're part of a team, and you've got to really support your brethren, your fellow workers, and help them to understand. Because we found that many of our workers over the 2.5 years forgot many of the things that they've been taught. So there's a lot of retraining going on now to try and remind them of what are their obligations in the position that they hold within the company. My wife Yoni and I have worked very, very hard for many years to get the quality that we now believe we have. But to keep that quality is becoming very difficult with cheap prices and cheap products. The government needs to start looking at these companies and making them go through the paperwork that they have to go to become legal, so that then they can pay their taxes the same as we do, and do all the things that they're obligated to do as a company in Bali to support the island. Okay, I think I can leave it there. I don't need to have the full 15 minutes. I've said just about all I need to say.
Sir.
But thank you guys for listening.
You bring the concern to us that we need to pay attention or make a choice which one we want to choose, the quantity or the quality of the people.
Absolutely.
Yes, and also you also emphasize and also encourage us to work together as a team.
Very much.
Yes, to maintain Bali's authenticity. So to make it more sustainable and to make it Bali go back with our prestige.
Back to your roots.
Yes. And thank you very much, Mr. Nigel. We are going to
You're
have
welcome.
the question and answer sessions.
The question is, should we enforce it? Will it help your business, Nigel, to have everybody in every business certified correctly, international standards, so we can say Bali becomes the first sustainable destination in the world with everybody certified, so we can hold our heads up high?
Thank you, Mr. Lister. Who would you like to answer this question?
Yes, sure.
Mr. Nigel?
Alistair, a good question, and I did touch on that slightly when I was talking. However, it's always a little bit dangerous to be too critical of the government. In my 42 years in Bali, I've found that less said is sometimes the best. But on this situation, I must say, because since COVID, it's not a level playing field anymore. And that is what we need. Every business needs to be on a level playing field. As it was touched on by the previous speaker, we were talking about hotels not having a discotheque built right next to them. Well, I've been in this situation where I opened my first rafting company, and the owners of the land then decided to build a huge piggery next to us, and we ended up having to pay to move the piggery away because our guests were being upset by the smell of the pigs. This happens quite a lot. Hotels have often built on rivers, and people on the other side of the river suddenly decide that the hotel has the view of their land, so they then expect to be paid for that view. We had the same problem on the river where people expected us to pay if we went past their village on the river, even though they didn't own the river, the government did. These are always continued problems, and it's always going to be expected when poorer village people come up against businesses that look like they're very, very rich and they can afford to pay. And you can't blame them for that in many ways, but there needs to be rules and regulations to protect investors. Otherwise, they're going to get their business burned right from the day one. And I know many hoteliers who've had that similar problem in Ubud area, where they were harassed by village people shining glass panels into their hotel, into the rooms, to upset the guests until the village was paid money for them to stop doing it. So this is a continual problem. It's been going on for as long as I've been here, certainly since the 80s. So we have to definitely think of that, Alistair. It's very important. We've got a situation in Ubud where there are so many people who are in illegal businesses, it's almost uncountable. There are buses going around all over the place with what we call freelance agents, who are literally blackmailing the rafting companies into giving them ridiculously low prices so that they can make maximum profit. For instance, a rafting tour which is sold to the tourists for about 995,000 rupiah is being bought for as little as 120,000 rupiah. The freelance agent then, with his little bus, that's his only investment, he can then sell it for 800,000 and still undercut companies like ours by doing that. It's a very normal practice that goes on. And of course, if you don't have much infrastructure and you haven't had to follow government regulations, you then find that the playing field is no longer flat and fair. You can't compete against that because your infrastructure is far more expensive and it has to be paid back at some stage, and you have to make a profit to support a large infrastructure. Whereas if you've got no infrastructure at all and you just open and say you're a rafting company, the only office you have is your kampung house or your mobile phone, it's hardly fair to the businesses that are much larger and have to pay taxes and are pestered by government tax officers and all these sorts of things because we stand out so much. I don't know if any of you remember, but Mason Adventures, which we are now called, used to be named Bali Adventure Tours. We were the first at Bali Adventure Tours. We're the first company to do that with all our infrastructure, with a helicopter, rafting, mountain cycling, the elephants, etc. So we had to change the name because our name was being plagiarized. By that, if you don't understand the word plagiarized, it means copied by many other companies who would use part of your name to pretend that they were the same company. This is a deceptive way of getting business, but it's quite common on this island. The other part of that is that these freelance agents can lie and say whatever they like with complete impunity because there's no recourse for them because they're not licensed. You can't take action against them because they're faceless people. So we changed the name Bali Adventure Tours to Mason Adventures to try and escape that pit that we'd fallen into where we were being copied by so many people. And I now have the same situation since we've reopened. These freelance agents literally blackmail us, and if we don't deal with them and give them the price that they want, they not only refuse to use your tour, but they also tell you that they are not going to use it and they're going to use all means they can to avoid you. I've been told by some of these freelance agents who've come that they tell their guests that the elephant park hasn't opened since COVID. It's closed. So then they take them to somewhere else. This is a trick that's used a lot, and they'll say, oh, same river, doesn't matter what infrastructure or facilities you've built at great expense, they'll say, well, you know, it's the same river. And of course it is the same river, they're quite right, it is the same river. However, the product that you're buying is not the same, it's completely different. I don't know of any rafting company on this island at the moment, and there are more than 30, that actually is covered by insurance, except ourselves. I know that from the insurance company. So this is the kind of thing that's happening. The government needs to come in and put standards in place so that people do have to build proper infrastructure. They do have to insure their guests against death or accident. This is very, very important because the quality of Bali is reflected by what we do with our operation. And if we can't afford to give insurance, we are neglecting the tourists who are coming to this island, and we're setting up a very bad example. I think all companies know that. Hotels are in the same situation often. There's a plan to put people in the hotels that the agents want to put them into. And I'm not talking about the big international agents, I'm talking about these small little freelance guys who get around on the street and tell whatever story they want to tell. So a very good question, Alistair, and I think that the answer is that Bali Tourism itself should take this to hand and pressure the government to try and get as many companies, legitimate as possible, so that then there is recourse for the tourist, because otherwise the tourist has got nowhere to go to. For instance, in Australia we have institutions that do that. You can't make false advertising. You can't say you've got something that you don't actually have. You can't say you're the best in the world when you're not the best in the world. You've really got to make these standards to protect the guests who are coming to Bali, so that Bali's reputation is not tainted by people who are just out to make a quick buck and not actually put anything into Bali. They just want to take out.
Yeah.
I'd like to just add one thing, is that I was going to approach this, but I think I was running out of time. But that is that the infrastructure of Bali is at the moment in a very bad state. There seems to be a great emphasis on putting footpaths along the bypass where nobody walks on them. However, if we go up into the villages, particularly in Gyanya district, the roads are absolutely disastrous. There's more holes than there is asphalt. And, my buses are getting damaged daily by these bad roads. It's time for some thought to go into the roads and fixing them up in some of these bad areas. And I must say Gyanya is one of those areas that seems to need a lot of work on the roads, because without infrastructure, how do we operate? It's very difficult.
Yeah, sure. We are doing to try to make all the tourists being comfortable being in Bali with the infrastructure and also the legality. I would like to say thank you very much to all the 3 panelists. Give applause. And now we are going to have a photo session. So the time is back to Master of Ceremony. Thank you.